Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Paul Blustein, who is with the Center for Strategic and International Studies. That's in Washington, right?
That's right.
Yeah, and also worked as a reporter at Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, has written for a ton of different journals, and also has cranked out a number of fantastic books. The most recent book is this one. It's called King Dollar, The Past and Future of the World's Dominant Currency. And I have a couple others here that I've read over the years. This one, and the money kept rolling in and out. Wall Street, the IMF, and the bankrupting of Argentina. I feel like you could maybe write a sequel to this one, right?
Yes.
Then there's this one, Laid Low, Inside the Crisis That Overwhelmed Europe and the IMF. I think you kind of like crises. There's another one, right? The Chastening, right, which is also about the IMF trying to deal with some crises. You've got the Misadventures of Most Favored Nations, Off Balance, and this book called Schism about China-U.S. trade relations. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you. Yeah, pleasure to be here.
Well, look, let's maybe start by focusing on this book, King Dollar. And I think it's kind of timely because, I mean, it was just a few days ago that, there were some discussions about what to do with all of the money that was sort of impounded, right? The Russian money, the bank reserves and other assets that were more or less sequestered by the Western authorities. And there's a bit of a debate as to whether or not this can be used to lend money to Ukraine, right? And of course, there is a big debate about whether or not the dollar's days are over. And I think what you've said in the book is that the dollar's death has been greatly exaggerated multiple times, going all the way back to 1973. So I guess maybe one place to start is, why is there this dominant currency? I mean, look, we've had dominant currencies throughout history. I mean, if you go to Sweden and look at those Viking graves, you'll find the dirhams from, the Middle East, right? Abbasid Caliphate coins and so forth. And of course, the pound had its day. But there's never been the kind of dominance that we see today, right, with one single currency. I mean, is it driven entirely by network effects? I mean, how do we explain this?
Oh, I think network effects are certainly important in preserving it now. But it, of course, it goes back to a time when there was an international agreement, the Bretton Woods Agreement, which I'm sure most of your listeners are familiar with. All the countries get together and decide that the dollar is going to be at the center of the international monetary system. It'll be sort of loosely linked to gold, and all other currencies will be must be fixed to it. Richard Nixon got rid of that system in 1971, but and at the time there were a lot of worries that this would be it for the dollar, but that turned out to be one of the first times in which its death was prematurely exaggerated. I think it has remained as dominant currency, partly because of course, it's important that, everyone is using it for international transactions, international commerce, international finance at that time. But the dollar is the only currency of a currency issuing entity, the U.S. government, that has two very important features. One is an open capital account. Money can freely move across U.S. borders, in and out. China doesn't have that, and the U.S. has very deep, very broad, very liquid financial markets for one instrument in particular, U.S. Treasury securities. And Europe, although it has many of the features that the U.S. has that help bolster the dollar. It has very sophisticated financial markets. It has it has rule of law. And it's a very big economy. I think by GDP terms, it's maybe even slightly larger than the U.S. Or it's anyway, it's on certainly the same order of magnitude. And China's on the same order of magnitude. But Europe doesn't have that because it's 20 different sovereign entities, each of which issues its own securities, government securities. So it doesn't have the U.S. Treasury market like like the dollar does. So for those two very important reasons, I mean, although have been lots of predictions along the way, the Japanese yen and the renminbi, China, and so forth, that they would supplant the dollar. There's been no currency that has had those two very important features. I would argue that those are the two most important factors, and I think really the breadth, depth, and liquidity of U.S. financial markets is so crucial for people holding, who are trying to decide what currency they want to transact in internationally, because when a crisis arises, you want to have assets that you can quickly turn into cash without losing your shirt on, fire sale prices. And U.S. Treasuries are the asset that outshine any other by far in that regard. So that's, I think, maybe the most important factor. And
yes, I guess, if we think about the three definitions of money, right? it seems like the dollar wins on all three counts, right? Whether it's a store of value, right, a medium of exchange, or a unit of account. It really can't be beat.
Yeah. And, people find that's, I know probably not most of your listeners, but, even intelligent, well-informed individuals are perplexed. Why is there one currency that, that has to be used, it has to be dominant internationally? Money is money, and they all serve as most currencies anyway, serve perfectly well within the domestic economies of the various countries as medium of exchange, store of value, unit of account. But for international transactions, there's really it's not that it's the only one that can be used, but is by far the dominant one, as I say, for good reason.
Yeah, I think what most people don't understand is the extent to which the clearing and settlement functions are centralized, really. It seems like everything has to more or less go through some kind of choke point, and that choke point is more or less at the mercy of the U.S. government, right, and the Federal Reserve and the various regulatory bodies that are under the control of the U.S. government. And it also kind of highlights that some of these international bodies, which I think were set up to provide some of these functions, like the IMF, they're kind of like paper tigers. In all of your books, you highlight the role of the IMF, and I guess John Maynard Keynes had a different vision, right? He thought that you would have these international bodies kind of running the show. So, why is it that none of these international bodies have really turned out to be at the center of the financial economy?
Yeah, Keynes's vision, and it was, very noble and idealistic and all that, was that, you would have the IMF would not only serve as in the crisis fighting role that it does today in helping with countries with adjusting to balance of payments, deficits, and all the other things that the IMF does, but it would, in effect, serve as the issuer of the international currency, which he called Bancor, and he came up with this fiendishly complex scheme for how that all would work. But the U.S. wanted nothing to do with that. Harry Dexter White, the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury at the Bretton Woods Conference, put the U.S. was clearly going to be the hegemon and the dominant economy coming out of World War II, and you weren't going to be able to run an international monetary system without the U.S. So he was in a position to put the kibosh on, and he did. And as a result, the IMF, paper tiger is one way of looking at it. They're limited in the amount of money that they have by what all the member countries put in hard currency and currencies that can be used internationally. So it has a lot. It has hundreds of billions of dollars at its disposal, but in a real international crisis, that's not going to be enough. That's not going to cut it. Whereas the Federal Reserve, the issuer of dollars, can, with just create dollars out of thin air with keystrokes. I know this horrifies a lot of people. They think that it means that the Federal Reserve is part of some globalist conspiracy to deprive us of all of our precious bodily fluids or whatever. But that's a very important function that the Fed can serve in a crisis. It can create dollars out of thin air when there's shortages of dollars because everyone's scrambling for dollars for the reasons that I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, it's kind of wild that the Fed has become the lender of last resort, not just for the U.S. economy, but really for the global economy, right? I mean, we saw this just recently with Trump's bailout of Milei. I mean, this was, I mean, that's not the Fed, but it's the U.S. government. I mean, the U.S. is really the one that decides, not the IMF, right, what gets bailed out, because the IMF doesn't have the firepower, really.
Right. And of course, the U.S. has the largest shareholding at the IMF and veto power, because if you want to do something really important at the IMF, you have to get 85% of the votes on the board, and the U.S. controls 16.5% of the votes, which is actually smaller than its share of the global economy, but it's still enough to veto anything really big that the IMF might want to do. So, yeah, very good point. The U.S. serves as, or the Fed serves as lender of last resort for the whole economy for the whole global economy when a big crisis arises internationally, and this is controversial, and people get worked up about it. And why are we bailing out foreigners? Now, I'm not talking about the recent bailout of Milei. That's a separate question. But in a crisis, if the Fed doesn't make sure that shortages of dollars are alleviated, and if it doesn't do that, and there's a huge collapse of of one or several huge, really big financial institutions abroad, that's not going to be so good for us because we're all connected, and America will suffer. So I think this is enlightened self-interest on the part of the Federal Reserve.
Well, maybe we can talk about seigniorage, because I mean, one way to think about it is that the U.S., its largest export is the dollar, right? But I mean, we're not sending out just paper. I mean, we're sending out something that has tremendous value, right? And so we're kind of in the business of providing liquidity to the world, and it is kind of a for-profit business for the U.S., isn't it?
It is, yeah, and it's a lot of money that we earn. Every time a dollar gets held abroad in whatever form, even if it's just drug lords holding on to Benjamins in their under their mattresses or whatever kind of method they use to keep all their loot for ill-gotten gains for themselves. That's like a loan to the United States. They're not earning any interest on that. Or if it's foreigners holding treasury securities and they're earning interest on those, they're probably earning a bit less interest than they might like to earn, because we're giving them the privilege of holding our currency that's all, as it has all these great functions that we've just been talking about. So yeah, but the amount of money in seigniorage, I mean, it's big. It's in the tens of billions of dollars, but we're an economy that's we're midway between 30 and 40 trillion in GDP. So there was a time when that was a lot. Our seigniorage was a good bit more appreciable relatively than it is today. But it counts. It's good for America.
But look, I mean, the amount of liabilities that are being produced, you would never have imagined maybe 20, 30 years ago that it could have risen to this level, right, as a percentage of GDP. I mean, I think somewhere in the book you said that the amount of outstanding obligations have to rise with the amount of international trade. But it seems like it's rising at a much higher rate. It's almost, you know, exponential rather than linear. I mean, would we have ever been able to predict this? What's driving that? I mean, how are we able to sustain that?
Yeah, we've learned in the past, what, 10, 20 years that the US and other countries as well can run much more, substantial budget deficits as a percentage of their economies than we could have imagined. I mean, I
Now,
cut my
is
teeth.
that just because financial markets need more collateral? You know, they need more transaction balances. I mean, what's driving that?
Yeah, I mean, if you had told me when I started as a reporter, I, you can tell I'm old enough to remember a lot of stuff. And one of the things I remember is, the Reagan administration's budget deficits, which, everyone, we all had fainting spells about. Oh my goodness, you know, 5-6% of GDP, and the economy is growing. I mean, this was not during a recession. During a recession, it's fine for the government to borrow and spend money and tax less. But oh my goodness, these were during periods where the economy was humming along. Um, but since then we've had budget deficits, that have in the double digits during the in the wake of the global financial crisis, and then of course the COVID epidemic. And when you're in those sorts of situations, you spend the money to keep the economy from collapsing, and you worry about how you're going to pay for it later. It's austerity is kind of dumb in a situation like that. And now I am not a believer that what's Herb Stein's law, if something is unsustainable, well, then it will stop. I mean, I'm not a believer that Stein's law has been suspended. I think that the kinds of deficits we're running these days, which are officially projected at about 7% of GDP over the next decade, and it probably will be a good bit higher than that unless policy is fairly dramatically changed. I'm not a believer that that's I think that can end very badly with some type of financial crisis, because I don't think markets are infinitely willing to buy things like even Treasury securities without insisting on much more attractive returns to compensate for the risk. And that would mean very bad things for the U.S. economy. It means we'd be facing much higher interest rates, and probably the economy would be in dire straits.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe you can walk through the mechanics of correspondent banking, because I think, even moderately educated people still have a view, I think, of money movement that dates back to sacks of gold, right? If I have some dollars in France and I want to move them to somebody in Germany, the thought is that I'm going to kind of walk across the border, right? Or, send it in a carriage. But of course, all those dollars are sitting somewhere. I mean, to the extent they're sitting anywhere, right? They're sitting within the financial system of the United States, basically, right?
Yeah, correspondent banking is something that goes back to, I mean, I'm sure you know the details much better than I do, sort of medieval, early Renaissance Italian bankers, when you had to move money across long distances and you didn't want to have to risk sending a messenger, who would have bags of gold secreted in somewhere and would probably be stopped by highwaymen and deprived of the loot. So you had to use, you used books, ledgers, double entry accounting, and if they deposited gold with you, they would get credited, and then the records would be transported to some distant bank. And okay, you have a credit with that. Oh yes, well we trust, we know that banker. Yes, okay. So, you've made your payment, and we will give you the goods that that should be shipped back, and so that's sort of the beginning of it. But today, if you want to transact in dollars, and you're in some far-flung place way outside U.S. borders, you need to go through the correspondent banking system in one way or another. All dollars need to clear and settle in New York on the books of, ultimately, in the sense of the Fed, because if you make a payment, it isn't just that your account gets debited and the person you're paying gets debited. The two banks have to pay each other, and the way that works is that goes through on the books of the central bank. All those banks have accounts at the Fed, at the central bank. Those credits go up and down as payments are made by their customers from one to another. So, but some people, of course, bank at tiny little banks in far-flung places that don't have accounts at the Federal Reserve, so they need to have accounts at a correspondent bank that does have connections that can go through the clearing system in New York, so that these banks, if they're making a payment, the payment that they make gets cleared and settled through this network of it's a very ingenious system. It has its drawbacks, its slowness, then there are unfortunately some parts of the world where it's very hard to get served in it anymore, because people are so, governments, the U.S. government and others are so concerned about protecting against illicit finance, and that's one of the drawbacks. But it's this enormous, vast churning of dollars that goes on behind the scenes, and fortunately, most of the time we're only we pay no attention to it. It doesn't require it doesn't have huge crises and crunches that cause people to recessions to occur, or really bad things to happen. But and it works, and it's a lot bigger. Most people, I think, when they think of international transactions, they think of an immigrant worker sending money home to the family, which is a very important thing to try to facilitate. But that's a tiny part of this vast amount of money that's churning around the globe. Big companies paying each other, big banks paying interest, to foreign customers or foreign depositors, whatever. That's where the money is, and it goes through a lot of it goes through that correspondent banking system.
Well, I mean, look, the centralized nature of SWIFT and CHIPS means that there's potentially a lot of visibility, almost complete visibility into money movements, and maybe even a complete ability to interrupt those money movements if the governments decide to do so. Why did they really wield this power? I mean, it seems like it really only started to, with KYC and AML and all this stuff and OFAC. I mean, it didn't really kick in, I think, until after 9/11, right? I mean, there was a little bit before that, but that was really when the governments kind of woke up to their power. I mean, was it just that they didn't realize they could do this, or was it kind of more of a intentional policy that they didn't want to mess with it, right? To keep kind of public faith in it.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And one of the sentences that I'm kind of proud of in my King Dollar book, there aren't a whole lot of laugh out loud moments, but I liken this to little boys playing with a chemistry set and pouring one test tube into another, and boom, it explodes, and they realized that they could do it, and the U.S. Treasury, now part of this was that the USA Patriot Act, which was enacted after 9/11, when everyone was so exercised about the fact that the 9/11 terrorists had been able to get funding from Al Qaeda and execute, the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, and take flying lessons and all these other things that they did. Okay, well, we've got to make sure that funding is cut off to them. That was part of the reason for the USA Patriot Act, which which really tightened the screws on movements of money overseas and to stop illicit financing. And it wasn't no longer was it just going to be the drug lords and in Colombia and places like that. It was now the government was going to crack down on terrorists. Then the Treasury, OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, began doing some of that, and they realized that by cutting off banks abroad from access to that dollar system, to that correspondent banking system we were just talking about, that they could make things could really go boom. They could impose a death sentence on banks, and as they began to realize the power of that, they then applied it in the case of North Korea in 2005, and they were absolutely astonished to discover that this really worked. You could really have a big effect on North Korea's financial system by cutting off bank. They went after a bank in Macau, that had been doing some transactions with North Korea, and then they were off to the races. They could use this similar kind of weaponry on Iran and other adversaries. And of course, it was used. Everyone knows this, that it was used. They may not know the mechanics, but they know that it was used against Russia at the time of the invasion of Ukraine. So yeah, it's really picked up. You're right. After 9/11, and it's partly, it's a kind of a funny story that it was the case of the U.S. I mean, they had the power, which they did use in various ways a bit before 9/11, but really after 9/11 was when it really it's been going up and up and up. And even when the government gets worried that maybe they're overdoing it, as the Biden administration was worried that the Trump administration had overdone it, and they had this big study. Okay, we're not going to overdo it. But then Russia invaded Ukraine, and the Biden administration, I think, for good reasons, in my view, it's a matter of opinion, but I think it was for good reason. The Biden administration said, okay, well, we got this weapon. We said we weren't going to overuse it, but if not now, when? So, yeah.
But this is really where the failure of the IMF, SDR, that kind of system really comes to the fore, right? Because that means the U.S. government can decide unilaterally, right, on a whole bunch of things. Right? When they put those sanctions on Iran, I mean, Europeans weren't very happy about it, were they? I mean, Peugeot, right, you mentioned, was one company that had been doing tons of business of Iran. So it really becomes almost a fifth branch of the military. I mean, it's almost more powerful than our military.
Yeah, absolutely. A very good point. I mean, one of the reasons I embarked on this book was because of what Trump did in Iran. This was in 2018. After there had been a deal between the Obama administration and the Iranian government to lift the sanctions, and Iran would take steps to prevent its nuclear power program from being used to become to develop weapons. And then Trump, who for I think for his own kind of ego reasons, maybe more than any other, said, no, Obama gave away the store. He's a terrible deal maker. I know how to make deals. And he, abrogated that agreement. And the Europeans who had been party to that agreement were shocked, because a lot of their companies had gone back into Iran, and suddenly here's the U.S. government saying, no, the deal is off. And the Europeans said, oh, no, we still want the deal to, if you want to cut off deal, transacting with Iran, you do that, but we want to keep transacting with Iran. And And the U.S. government basically said, "Oh, really? I don't think so, because if your companies do business with Iran, they'll be cut off from the dollar." So this, yeah, this absolutely, it's like uh, it's a substitute for, it's a very powerful weapon, and in some ways, uh, its lethality can be equivalent to military power, because people suffer, they lose their livelihoods, they aren't able to get the things that they need to live. But it's it's better than just dropping a bunch of bombs and boots on the ground and people getting killed. It's in some ways better to that, but this is why in the book I argue that the principle we ought to apply, this probably sounds a bit juvenile, but the Spider-Man principle: with great power comes great responsibility. So if you have this power with the dollar, if we use it responsibly, which I don't think Trump did in 2018, but if we use it responsibly, it can be a very good power. And if we use it irresponsibly, it's a bad power. And that's the way I like to look at it. I don't think we need to think about losing the power of the dollar so much, because I think we're going to have it. The U.S. Is going to have it, whether we use it responsibly or not. Is that a good thing? Well, that's another story.
Well, I mean, you quoted somebody who said, the more you use this power, the less effective it will be. I mean, it doesn't seem to be borne out, but I mean, is there a concern? I mean, is that really what the concern is behind some of the resistance that we've seen to the seizure of the Russian assets, for instance? Because it doesn't seem like the Americans care. They're not worried. But it seems like SWIFT and the Europeans are resisting this. Maybe talk a bit, because SWIFT is unusual. It's based in Europe, as opposed to all of these other institutions, which are based in the U.S. And you tell a little story about how SWIFT tried to kind of resist the efforts of the U.S. authorities to kind of, oversee everything. And, I know the Swiss tried to resist certain things, but it seems like resistance is futile.
Well, of course, another reason the Europeans are concerned is that a lot of the Russian assets are in euros. They're parked in something called Euroclear, also in Belgium. Yeah, in Belgium. So the Belgians are the ones who are particularly concerned that, no one's going to want to park their money here, and they're not going to trust these institutions if they have to worry that, like kind of like the heavens are going to open up and a big lightning bolt is going to shoot down and you zap, we've taken your money and we're going to keep it. We're going to do what we want with it. It's understandable that Europeans would be concerned about that. But of course, there are other, on the other side of the coin for them, they're the ones who have to be much more concerned than we do that Putin is going to be sending troops into their territory. So their resistance to this idea of using those assets has been eroding, and where they end up coming down, they've already gone pretty far toward accepting the idea that we can freeze those assets and keep them, and we can use them to lend money to Ukraine and use them as collateral, and these very complicated.
Well, I don't know. Have they approved that? I know they've used the interest generated by the assets.
Interest generated. Yes, excuse me. Yeah. That's right. Yes, good point.
And now they're talking about lending those assets, right, against any kind of reparations as collateral.
Right. Yeah. They've been going further and further. And part of the reason for that is that they're concerned that the Trump 2 administration, the current one, is not willing to exercise the power of the dollar as much as they think would be meritorious. So they're increasingly looking to their own resources, which consist of these Russian assets sitting in Euroclear, and so forth. In these Belgian institutions that have this power to that they're concerned. They're understandably concerned about overusing it, but because they're concerned about Putin and they're concerned about Trump, and they do have a lot of leverage at their disposal, so they're increasingly moving toward, in the direction anyway, of using financial weaponry in a more aggressive way than before.
Yeah. So now I wanted to ask you about the various pretenders to the throne, right? So I mean, there was a time when people thought the yen was going to be the new reserve currency, and then that kind of fizzled out. And then I think for a while people thought, oh, the euro, awesome, no more pesetas and drachmae, this is going to be the next reserve currency. And it hasn't really caught on. And now, of course, right, the Chinese, they're trying to push the RMB, and it seems like all of these efforts have kind of fizzled, but sometimes for different reasons.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, in Japan's case, the Japanese they weren't really interested in internationalizing.
People were more worried about it happening than the Japanese were interested in having it happen, right?
Absolutely. The Japanese model depended on exporting a lot of stuff, and they wanted to keep their currency weak because that made their products more competitive. That was part of it. They wanted their banks, their whole financial system, to be geared up to be funding the Mitsubishis and the Matsushittas and the Sonys and the Hondas and the Toyotas and so forth of the world. And that meant keeping the money at home so that they could build factories. So when the U.S. as Japan began, it wasn't just rising from the ashes of World War II, it was becoming a significant, economic superpower in the early 80s, and in the late 70s even. So the U.S. was beginning to get rather annoyed about the incursion of Japanese goods into the U.S. market. U.S. consumers seemed to like them a lot, and the U.S. was looking at this. Wait a minute, you're using your financial system in this way, and we don't like it, and we want the yen to rise. It's fascinating. I mean, this was the U.S. government, in effect, saying we want to share. Reserve currency status with you. We don't want to have it all to ourselves. And the Japanese were at first, we're happy to do some of the things. Some of the things you're saying are fairly reasonable. Maybe we could do those over the next 10 or 15 years. And the U.S. said, no, we want it done. No, you have to do it a lot faster. And there was an agreement in 1984 that kind of got things moving. Was
that the Plaza Accord?
And the Plaza Accord in 1985, which was an agreement that that the Japanese would take really significant action to try to push the yen up. Now, when I'm talking about its exchange rate, we're not talking, I'm not talking about, it's very important not to conflate these two things: the strength of a currency in terms of its exchange rate versus the strength of the currency in terms of its use in international. The dollar has been up, it's been down over the decades of its international dominance. Same for the yen. So anyway, the Japanese weren't interested, and they dragged their feet. And by the time they had really taken more steps to open up their financial system, their economy was, for all kinds of reasons that we don't have to go into. I mean, there's still controversy about what happened. But the Japanese economy was no longer looking like the 10-foot giant that was going to 800-pound gorilla that was going to devour the world, and the economy has been on a secular decline in terms of its relative position in the world economy. So there's the yen, and then the euro. just really big bunch of very successful economies getting together and creating a common currency. There were some very distinguished economists saying in the late 1990s, as the Europeans moved forward on that, this is okay. We're finally going to have at least a bipolar reserve currency system. It'll be the dollar and the euro. They'll be equal. And the euro did very well, but although there'd been also warnings that the Europeans were making a big mistake by joining so many sovereign governments together and having a common currency. Though the euro was quite successful, and then the global financial crisis came along in 2008, and then there were really a lot of predictions. Oh my God, the dollar is done, and then there were even more predictions that the euro might supplant it, but guess what happened? If you know I know probably a lot of your listeners know that just not very long after the global financial crisis, there was a huge crisis in the Eurozone, which really brought home to everybody that having a common currency for all these sovereign governments was problematic, and that was pretty much the end of speculation about the euro supplanting the dollar. And the Chinese, as their economy has loomed, as Japan's did, as an 800-pound gorilla that might take over the world. There were some very, very economists who I have tremendous respect for, predicting that that the renminbi would dethrone the dollar in one way or another. But because China has moved much more in an authoritarian direction under Xi Jinping, which makes people nervous about whether their renminbi assets will be treated fairly, and whether the Chinese government might slam the door in a crisis and say you can't take your money out. So for all those reasons, the renminbi has not gotten very far. It's way down in the league tables of currencies.
So it seems like even if the policymakers are doing everything in their power to take away some of the attractive features of the dollar, right? It's still it's terrible, except it's the best compared to everybody else, right?
Right. Yeah, the cliche about the dollar is, it's the least dirty shirt in the laundry. I'm not saying, far be it from me to ever suggest that U.S. government policy, especially under this administration, but even under previous ones, was perfect, and that this is why the dollar deserves to be the dominant international currency. I think I'm very concerned that as I mentioned some time ago as we were talking, that because of the huge budget deficits, and of course the Trump beating up on the Federal Reserve and making it very clear that he's going to insist on appointing a replacement for Chair Powell, who will be a low interest guy, no matter what. That's got to be terribly worrisome to investors around the world, and I can easily imagine a crisis materializing because of all that. But then there's still the question of what are you going to use in international commerce, and that's where those network effects that you also very astutely mentioned early in our conversation. The network effects are so deep, so entrenched, that it's very difficult for me to see how the global economy is going to find some other currency to transact in across borders.
Well, I mean, it seems like the bigger concern.
But it's not because everything's perfect.
Yeah, but it seems like the bigger concern is not inflation, but really if there's some erosion of the rule of law, right? So, I mean, I think one of the reasons why we think the dollar is attractive is because, unlike the RMB, we don't think that we're going to wake up one morning and find that our bank accounts have been seized, right? Like, because the government doesn't like us for some reason. I mean, if you're in China, you might wake up and realize, you can't buy your favorite food anymore. You can't get on the on the subway, right? Because your account has
Yes.
been disabled. And one could imagine that if you didn't have, I mean, if you can unilaterally impose policies related to Iran or Russia, I think most people are kind of okay with that. But what if they decided, oh, I don't like Canada, so I'm just going to say, guess what? Canadian deposits can't be withdrawn or something until I get my way. I mean, I think that would be the bigger concern.
Yeah. How absolutely. And I'm horrified with what's happening with rule of law in the United States. This is another thing where policy is not only not perfect, it's getting awful. Hardly anything depresses me more when I read the news than the latest abuses of of the Department of Justice by Trump. Are we getting to the point where global investors won't be able to distinguish between the fairness of U.S. courts in arbitrating disputes over assets than with China? I mean, they'll say no, it's pretty much the same. There's political powers are going to decide whether they like you or not, and that's how courts are going to rule. If if that happens, Katie, bar the door. It's the only way I can really think about it. But are we there yet? No, I don't think we're there yet. So,
well, I mean, I think if I mean, in that case, the only alternative would be one of these, cryptocurrencies. Although, it's really difficult to use these things without going through the banking system. I mean, it's like, the minute you want to, I mean, you'd need a very, very radical increase in the number of folks who are willing to participate in that economy before it would be a viable alternative.
Yeah. Of all the things that I see as viable alternatives, that's way down the list. I mean, I don't know what type of cryptocurrency you're talking about, but yeah, they're most of them are backed by nothing. Of course, there's stable coins which are backed by fiat, but 99% of those are backed by U.S. dollars. So we're kind of back to square one with those.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of conversation, and I think in the book you spend some time talking about central bank digital currencies, and you mentioned the parachute pants, right? Reference.
Yeah.
And it doesn't seem like it's really a relevant part of the discussion of the rise of the dollar. I mean, some people have been saying that, oh, look, the Chinese now have come up with this wonderful new technology, and if the U.S. doesn't match that technology, they might get dethroned. And that seems to be overblown at best.
Yeah, for sure. My God, there was such panic back in 2020 and 2021 when the Chinese rolled out the pilot program, and it's still technically a pilot program for what they call the ECNY, as it's the CNY being the symbol for the Chinese yuan, the renminbi as their currency is formally called. Yeah. Oh my God, there was a lot of people got in such a dither about it. Again, I think this ignores the more fundamental factors that keep the dollar dominant: the depth, breadth, and liquidity of U.S. financial markets, particularly the market for Treasury securities, and the fact that people have to worry that if they have their assets in renminbi, whether it's CBDC or just or just an ordinary deposit at a Chinese bank, that they have to be concerned about about whether they'll be able to get their money out in a crisis. So,
and that's it's completely independent of technology. It has nothing to do with technology.
It is, I think. I mean, there are efforts underway and the People's Bank of China, the central bank, is very much in the forefront of this, trying to find ways in which CBDCs, their central bank digital currency, can be exchanged seamlessly and interoperably, and all these other terms that are that get bandied about in the lingo of fintech. They they're working on trying to develop ways for their CBDC to be used in that way, because they want to protect themselves, understandably, against the U.S. using the kind of sanctions against them that were used against Russia in 2022. They'll probably make some headway. But yeah, it's I think one of the fun, really fun things I had in doing this book was going back and looking at all the ways in which people, we're just wigging out about. It's not just this Chinese CBDC; it's the other episodes we've that you kindly mentioned over the years, where people worry about the dollar and its death is greatly exaggerated. Yeah, the Chinese CBDC was one of the more hilarious ones, because people were talking as if, not only would China's CBDC, dethrone the dollar and everyone would be using it all over the world, but, heck, the CBDC, I mean, that's something that's in your phone. So, as you have these things in your phone, all your personal information would be like transmitted back to Xi Jinping, and he'd be sitting there, in Beijing, going, I now
as
see,
if it isn't already,
what you're
right?
spending your money on. Yeah. And, part of this is paranoia about the, about the Chinese. Part of it's paranoia about technology.
But the thing is, it's already doable, right? I mean, if you're using Alipay, it's
right.
they already have all that information if they want it, right?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. They sure do. Good point.
Well, you also there's a short bit in the book on the Libra project, and I remember following this. I know some folks that were involved in this, and I was actually kind of surprised at how quickly that imploded. I mean, it seemed like there was a real opportunity to create this new payment medium, and obviously they made some strategic mistakes. But were you surprised at all by the fierceness of opposition by central banks to Facebook's initiative?
Well, I wouldn't say it's surprising, to looking back on it, that the central banks were upset about the initial proposal, because that was for a currency, a digital currency that would be transmitted, in a basket of currencies, which would be, which Facebook would hold, or the consortium of companies that Facebook, led, that did pose a threat, I think, to the monetary sovereignty of central banks, and it would be, they had this idea, it would be quote unquote permissionless, right? I mean, anybody could transact on this. That was their vision for it. But anyway, there was of course, a big hue and cry, partly it was, just that people don't like Mark Zuckerberg, and they don't like, and Facebook had been through some scandals. And that explains part of the resistance. But, then Facebook and the other companies they're involved with, but, really did it, I wouldn't call it about face, but they really changed the nature of what they were proposing. And it would be, currencies that would be, and they called it DM. They changed the name. Well, of course, that doesn't matter much, but it would be a stable coin, a currency, backed by a reserve of fiat currency, of fiat money. And it would be not denominated. It wouldn't be a basket. There would be a dollar version. There would be a yen version. There would be a euro version, a Swiss franc.
It would be just like Circle, or what PayPal's doing, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And you would use the Facebook network as a way of helping to develop the network effects to make the thing work. And they brought in Stuart Levy, who had been Undersecretary of the Treasury, for I can't remember the exact title, but I mean, he was basically in charge of all the sanctions that had been imposed on Iran. And he had taken, and then after leaving the Treasury, he had gone to work for, I think it's HSBC, which had gotten into a lot of hot water over its failure to implement effective money laundering safeguards, and so this guy. I mean, I've interviewed him for my book a couple of times. He's very, very conscientious, concerned about all this illicit finance. And no, this was not going to be a permissionless system. If you were going to use Libra, you were going to have to go through KYC. You were going to have to, submit documents. They weren't just going to allow anybody to send money over this network. He really, made it, turned it into a kind of a different proposal. And yeah, I don't know. I have no inside information, but I should think that the folks at Facebook might be beavering away. Libra was developed kind of in secret, in some what is it, Menlo Park? Is that where they're headquartered?
Yep.
That they would be, maybe there's some secret facility where they're, going to bring it back now that the U.S. government is a good bit more favorably disposed toward stable coins. Yeah, who knows?
Yeah,
it wasn't that bad a proposal by the time they got finished with it, but the Biden administration really put the kibosh on that.
Well, look, I love this quote. I think it's John Connolly or somebody who said, it's our dollar, but it's your problem, right? Something like that, right?
Yeah.
But
yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
to what extent is it becoming less of a problem for, say, China and Russia? I mean, they're obviously investing a lot in trying to come up with new ways of not just replacing the dollar, but also figuring out ways to continue to use the dollar, but without the potential of sanctions. I mean, to what extent are these initiatives actually working?
Well, it's sort of two, Russia and China in different ways, I think, trying to make sure that they are, that they battened down the hatches and prevented the U.S. from using financial weaponry against them. In the Russian case, they successfully managed to keep their economy from the collapse that was widely predicted in February of 2022, at the time when those sanctions were imposed. One of the ways, the first thing to understand about those sanctions is, that the Biden administration was terrified of using it on oil exports, because they did not want to stop Russian oil from flowing into global markets. The price of gasoline would have skyrocketed, and inflation would have taken off all over the place. And that would have been a bad thing economically. It also would have been rather bad for the Biden administration's political support in the United States. So they didn't want to do that. So there are good economic reasons as well, I suppose. But anyway, as the Russians survived the initial hit, they began, the Biden administration and the Europeans began to look at ways that how they could choke off Russia from getting oil revenue, and they came up with the idea of putting a cap on the price of oil that would be enforced using sanctions. And the Russians figured out ways of getting around that by developing a fleet of ships which is commonly known as a shadow fleet of ships that could operate without some of the insurance that you need to load up a big tanker and float it, and it goes sailing around in the high seas. So they
and to be clear, the only reason why this is doable is because the only way to pay for the oil is to pay for it through the banking system, which is under the supervision of the Fed, right?
And yes, and to get insurance on a ship, those insurance companies are deathly afraid of being cut off from the dollar system. So yeah, there too. There are all these ways. It was really very quite ingenious. It had been used somewhat a similar thing against Iran in the early 2000s. So the idea was, have a price cap and use the power of the dollar for that. So yeah, but the Russians, have found, sanctions are not a silver bullet. They're very powerful, and if the U.S. were willing to really use sanctions on Russia, and come what may, okay, if we're going to have a big spike in the price of gasoline, that's a price we're willing to pay. We have to stop Putin. We have to crush him. Make the Russian economy, turn Russians against him by making them all poor. We could do it. The U.S. could do that, but it would be very costly to us. And I would say, I guess, similarly with China. China's economy is 10 times the size of Russia's, and we can use the power of the dollar to really inflict damage on the Chinese banking system. But the price we would pay is, we've seen that, we've just seen in the past, couple of months that the Chinese have weapons too. They have rare earths. They can cut off. They're the manufacturing. They have choke points. That's where their choke point is, and they can cut us off. And if we use try to use leverage, economic leverage on them, well, they are not. They are not helpless by any means. On the contrary, yeah.
It would seem like it would be easier for us to wean ourselves off Chinese manufacturing than it would be for the Chinese to wean themselves off the dollar.
I think they're both. Which one is easier? I don't know if the word easier is the word I'd use. I'd say, less impossible.
Right. So they're like, it's our stuff, but it's your problem, right? That's their flip.
Yeah, it's our stuff. Yes. Yeah. Some of the stories I've, probably, I'm sure many of your listeners have seen that Chinese, it isn't just rare earths, it's medicine. And it's not that the Chinese make all our, everything you buy at the, at CVS or get at the pharmacy counter, but they make all the ingredients, not all the ingredients, but a lot of the key ingredients for some huge percentage of our medicine. And they control 85%, or I can't cite chapter and verse on this, but now, is that a choke point? Is that something that they can use the way they've used rare earths? Well, maybe not, but it's an indicator of just how much leverage they have, which they would be willing. If we really got them by the throat and we're saying we're going to choke you off, we're so mad at you, we're going to ruin your economy. Well, Xi Jinping doesn't have to worry about elections, and the Chinese people can be roused to a great patriotic fervor, and if they're being bullied, and I would think that he would be perhaps a lot more willing than Donald Trump to say, all right, bring it on. You want to try to choke me to death? I will choke you to death. We'll both choke, but I'll bet you cry uncle first. And I think we would cry uncle first.
And so presumably those are some of the scenarios that have been played out if there were, say, an invasion of Taiwan.
Of Taiwan. I'm sure they have. And, some of the hawks you don't hear so much from these guys anymore, but the hawks in Congress have tried to game some of these out. I go into this in one of the chapters of the book about how they had a red team and a blue team, and they thought, well, we can, we just done this, impose drastic sanctions on Russia. So if there's an invasion of Taiwan, here's what we do. And I think they've discovered that if you have a really knowledgeable red team playing the Chinese Communist Party, they can come up with a lot of things that will give pause to the U.S. government. So maybe we ought to be looking for ways to resolve the Taiwan issue. It preserves Taiwanese democracy, but doesn't have us at each other's throats, because a lot of people could end up suffering.
Well, look,
That's the
last question.
conclusion I
I
came
want to
to.
go back.
Yeah.
I want to go back to the Argentina book for a second because,
Okay.
it seems like, history sometimes goes back and forth. Remember, Milei promised that he was going to dollarize the economy and has sort of backed off of that promise. Um, I mean, this whole idea of dollarization, I mean, clearly everybody is already to some degree dollarized, right, without being
Yeah.
completely dollarized. Are you surprised by the things that have been happening in Argentina in the last couple years?
Well, I was, I couldn't help but feel encouraged that, Milei was, going further than one of his more interesting predecessors, who had, gone some distance toward liberalizing the economy. Milei was really
Macri.
dismantling some of the, Macri, he was making good headway, and inflation was coming down from the sky high levels. And as someone who really, it just breaks your heart when you go to Argentina and you see these really good, decent people, some of whom are really hardworking, intelligent, well educated, and their livelihoods, their hopes for the future are just destroyed by these endless series of crises. So yeah, but Milei is a very headstrong guy, and became convinced that we have to peg the peso to the dollar and let it go up and up and up, and at least that'll make imports cheaper. That, I think, is a pretty big mistake. So of course people were taking money out of the country, as they were in the crisis that I wrote about in the book that you kindly mentioned. And but everyone wants to, or people will convert their money to dollars, which they figure is going to be safer than the peso, and so the central bank is obliged to hand over the dollars to them, and so the dollar, the money goes flying out in that way as well. So I must say, dollarization, might be a good option for Argentina, or at least the least. We're back to the least awful. But there's all this talk now about the Trump administration pushing dollarization on other countries as well, because they're worried about they've also become a little alarmed about what might happen to the dollar. And they want to, bully countries into dollarizing, not only in the sense of, using the dollar for international transactions, which is, we've been saying all throughout this conversation. Yeah, that's, countries don't have much choice, but in their domestic economies as well. I think this is terribly worrisome that and the Trump administration is pushing stable coins, dollar stable coins, as a way of supporting the development of the crypto industry. And the Genius Act that was passed this summer, would give a big boost to the use of this type of cryptocurrency around the world. I think it's very worrisome if that economies will lose their monetary sovereignty if they're trying to control their the macroeconomic variables to ensure that they grow at a stable rate, non-inflationary rate. But if dollars are pouring in the form of stable coins, and people are using that to pay for their groceries or their clothing or their rent or a cup of coffee, and I mean that makes it very difficult for their authorities to run their economies. And it has some advantages, because if you're an economy where the government is basically kleptocratic and they're going to crack down on you and take your property away from you, then you want to have a way of protecting yourself. So it's good, that you have stable coins to turn to, but it's probably not so good for the general populace and or the future, long-term future of the country. So this dollarization phenomenon, much more broadly than Argentina, I think is could end badly. And I think we all ought to be concerned about not, it may not be so bad for the U.S. economy, but after all, we at least those of us with economic backgrounds like you and me like to think, well, we're all in this big global economy together, and we're all interlinked. And if other economies do well, we'll do well. That's kind of a really basic concept that I think people ought to acknowledge. And I'm concerned about dollarization, but I'm not
Paul,
worried about the
so
dollar.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, we could have these countries turn into the next version of Greece, right?
Yes, yes.
Paul, thanks so much for joining me. This latest book is called King Dollar, The Past and Future of the World's Dominant Currency. Check it out. It's a bit of history. It takes you right up to the present, however. And don't forget this. I certainly hope this book still is in print and the money kept rolling in, because it's fantastic. Also Laid Low and a couple others. Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much. My pleasure.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.